In 1902, a man digging in his garden was shocked to discover numerous skeletons buried on his property. He immediately alerted the local authorities. It turned out that what the man had found were the skeletal remains of 5 babies who had been murdered. Each child had been strangled with a kind of white rubber cord, wrapped in cloth, sprinkled with lime to reduce the odor of decay, and then buried. When investigators tried to identify the skeletons, they realized that the man was living in the former residence of a notoriously cruel baby killer, Amelia Elizabeth Dyer, who had murdered up to 400 babies over several decades. Known as a baby farmer, Amelia Dyer is regarded as the most notorious serial killer in England. In the 1800s, during the Victorian era in England, the practice of baby farming was in high demand. Women who had children out of wedlock would often pay midwives or someone else to take care of their babies in exchange for money. Wealthy women also entrusted their children to baby farmers or wet nurses, who would breastfeed and care for the babies until a certain age, after which they would be reclaimed. Some women used the services of baby farmers because the young mothers were not yet financially prepared to care for their babies. Some would take their babies back, while others would abandon them completely. These babies were usually placed in a home and cared for lovingly. However, in Amelia Dyer's case, things were drastically different. She would brutally kill the babies and use their deaths for her own financial gain. Amelia Dyer was born as Amelia Elizabeth Hobley in 1836. The exact date of her birth is uncertain. She was the youngest of 5 siblings, with 3 brothers, Thomas, James, and William, and a sister, Anne, in the small village of Pile Marsh, east of Bristol. Her father, Samuel Hobley, was a skilled shoemaker, and her mother was Sarah Hobley. As a child, Amelia learned to read and write and developed a love for literature and poetry. However, her childhood was marred by her mother's mental illness. After recovering from typhus, her mother's emotional outbursts became uncontrollable, and Amelia continued to care for her until she died in 1848. Historians later suggested that this experience may have had a lasting impact on Amelia's mental health in the future. Amelia had an older sister, Sarah Ann, who died in 1841 at the age of 6, and a younger sister, also named Sarah Ann, who died in 1845 at just a few months old. After her mother's death, Amelia lived with an aunt in Bristol for a while before becoming an apprentice to a corset maker. Her father passed away in 1859, and her eldest brother, Thomas, inherited the family shoemaking business. Somehow, Amelia lost contact with most of her family. She later married George Thomas, who was 59 years old, while Amelia was about 24 at the time. The two lied about their ages on the marriage certificate to reduce the age gap. George subtracted 11 years from his age, and Amelia added 6 years to hers. Together, they had a daughter named Ellen Thomas. After marrying George Thomas, Amelia trained to become a nurse. She learned from a midwife named Ellen Dane, who introduced her to an easier way to make a living by using her home as a place for young women who were pregnant out of wedlock or had unwanted pregnancies. Amelia would take in these babies in exchange for payment from their mothers. This practice was known as baby farming. In Victorian England, unmarried mothers often struggled to earn a living. Especially after the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 removed the financial obligation of fathers for children born out of wedlock. Raising children as single mothers was heavily stigmatized in society. As a result, baby farming practices became common, where someone, often a nurse, would act as an adoption or fostering agent in exchange for payment from the mothers. Many businesses were established to house these young women and care for them until they gave birth. The mothers would then leave their unwanted babies to be cared for as nurse children. However, immoral caregivers chose to let the babies starve to save money and even hastened their deaths. Crying or fussy babies were often drugged with alcohol or readily available opiates. Many babies died as a result of these questionable practices. In 1869, Amelia's husband, George Thomas, passed away, and Amelia needed an income. Her training as a nurse from Ellen Dane, which had introduced her to baby farming, would prove very useful. Unfortunately, Amelia took things a step further. She began placing ads in local newspapers, presenting herself as a respectable married woman offering a safe and loving home for children. She would then demand a large one-time payment for her services. Instead of using the money to feed and care for the children, Dyer realized there was an easier way to pocket the funds, by disposing of the children. Initially, Amelia used the technique of overdosing babies on opiates, which was meant to calm crying infants. She would then call the coroner to confirm the babies' deaths, feigning surprise that the babies had died so quickly and pretending to mourn their passing. In 1872, Amelia married William Dyer, a brewery worker from Bristol. They had 2 more children, Mary Ann, known as Polly, and William Dyer. However, Amelia eventually left her husband. In 1879, a doctor became suspicious about the number of deaths he reported concerning the babies under Amelia's care. He began to question whether these deaths were truly accidental. The doctor reported Amelia to the authorities, but instead of facing murder charges, Amelia was only sentenced to 6 months of hard labor for neglecting the babies in her care. However, this did not deter Amelia. After her release, she placed more advertisements for a safe home for babies and continued to collect payments for her services. If a baby she had killed had parents wanting to reclaim their child, she would provide them with another baby. Eventually, Amelia Dyer realized that continuously reporting the deaths of babies to the authorities and requesting death certificates would endanger her. Recognizing her mistake, she began taking other measures. She started disposing of the bodies herself, wrapping the babies in cloth and burying them, throwing them in rivers, or hiding them throughout the city. Amelia also used various methods to kill the babies, having no consistent pattern in her techniques. Amelia Dyer also kept a close watch on the authorities. If she sensed they were starting to suspect her or were about to apprehend her, she would feign depression and claim that she had thoughts of self-harm. She was admitted to mental health facilities several times for treatment. On one occasion, she even attempted to harm herself by ingesting 2 bottles of laudanum, an overdose, but she survived. Dyer frequently moved from one city to another, adopting a new identity for each of her activities to evade the police and the parents who sought to reclaim their children. It is estimated that over nearly 30 years of her baby farming activities, Amelia Dyer could deaths of more than 400 children and profited from their care. Researchers believe that the number could be twice as high if she had not been apprehended. In March 1896, a bargeman was fishing in the River Thames when he came across a bag floating in the river. Upon opening it, he was shocked to find the tiny body of a baby girl wrapped in paper inside the bag. A police officer carefully noted a nearly faded name written in the corner of the paper, Mrs. Thomas, along with an address. The address was traced back to Amelia Dyer's residence, and although the police were able to locate Amelia thanks to the baby's body, they could not charge her with the crime without direct evidence. So, they set up a trap. The police used a young woman as bait and pretended to place an advertisement seeking a good care facility for a baby. Amelia Dyer quickly responded to the ad and arranged a meeting with the woman, which ultimately led to her being caught in the trap. Upon searching her home, the police discovered the smell of decaying flesh, a type of cloth used to bind the necks of babies, telegrams related to adoption arrangements, advertisements, and letters from mothers inquiring about their children. They also found items that had been packed, as if Amelia was preparing to move again. The police dredged the River Thames to search for more bodies. Realizing that she was not responsible for all the baby bodies discovered, Amelia only confessed to the deaths of the babies who had been strangled with white cord, which was a distinctive feature of her crimes. Dyer was arrested on April 4, 1896, and confessed to the murders. However, she assured the police that her daughter and son-in-law should not be arrested, as they were not involved in her crimes. During the preliminary hearing in early May, no evidence was found to suggest that Mary Ann Polly or Arthur Palmer had acted as accomplices to Amelia Dyer. Amelia Dyer submitted a letter requesting, "Sir, please allow me to present this to the judge on Saturday the 18th. I have made this statement because I may not have another chance, and I need to clear my conscience. I know and feel that my days on this earth are numbered, but it would be a terrible thing to involve innocent people in this matter. I am aware that I must answer to my Creator in heaven for the terrible crimes I have committed, but since the Almighty is my judge in heaven, I earnestly declare that my daughter Mary Ann Palmer and her husband Alfred Ernest Palmer had no part in my wrongdoing. They were unaware of my evil deeds until it was too late. I speak honestly and truthfully as I hope for forgiveness. I alone must stand before my Creator in heaven to answer for all that I have done with these hands of mine." Amelia Dyer, April 16, 1896. On May 22, 1896, Amelia Dyer appeared at the Old Bailey and pleaded guilty to one count of murder, claiming insanity as her defense. However, the jury determined that she had feigned insanity as a way to avoid punishment. Before her execution, Amelia learned that her daughter had been cleared of all charges. Amelia Dyer was executed by hanging, carried out by James Billington at Newgate Prison on Wednesday, June 10, 1896, at 9 a.m. Her last words before the execution were, "I have nothing to say." The Dyer case attracted national attention due to the high number of deaths, which ultimately triggered a revolution in adoption laws and prompted the government to revise regulations on baby farming to prevent similar cases in the future. Although it is estimated that the total number of her victims ranged between 300 and 400 babies, only 3 victims were identified and positively linked to Amelia Dyer. When Amelia Dyer was executed, her daughter had already been cleared of charges. But was she truly innocent as her mother claimed? 2 years after Amelia's death, a package was discovered on a train traveling from Bristol to London. The package contained a newborn baby who was still alive. The baby was eventually traced back to its mother, Jane Hill. This desperate young woman had handed her baby over to Mr. and Mrs. Stewart along with 12 pounds. The police soon uncovered the true identity of the Stewarts. They were Polly, Amelia Dyer's daughter, and her son-in-law, Arthur. This revelation cast doubt on the earlier claims of innocence and raised questions about the extent of their involvement. In 1888, the Whitechapel district of London was terrorized by a serial killer known as Jack the Ripper. The identity of this notoriously brutal killer was never revealed, but this did not stop ripperologists from speculating and suggesting hundreds of potential suspects, most of whom were men. However, increasing numbers of people began to suspect that the Ripper might actually have been a female serial killer, or Jill the Ripper. Remarkably, this theory was not new, but had been proposed by a prominent detective during the Ripper investigation itself. Do you think the perpetrator was not Jack the Ripper, but Jill the Ripper? Detective Aberline, 1888. The murder of the final known victim of the Ripper, Mary Jane Kelly, led to the theory that the perpetrator might have been a female killer. A credible witness and close friend of the victim, Caroline Maxwell, swore that she saw her friend walking briskly down Whitechapel Road a few hours after Kelly had been murdered and mutilated in her home. How could this be? One plausible answer, Detective Aberline concluded, was that what Maxwell saw was not Kelly, but the killer, Jill the Ripper herself, wearing Kelly's clothing. Evidence from the crime scene supports this theory. A woman's clothing, including a hat, was found burned in Kelly's fireplace. Friends of Kelly insisted that the clothing did not belong to Kelly and that she had never owned a hat. Could it be that the killer swapped clothes with the victim to make a getaway? In his 1939 book, Jack the Ripper, A New Theory, William Stewart attempts to profile a female killer. He concludes that the most likely candidate for Jill the Ripper would be a midwife or someone with surgical knowledge. A Victorian-era midwife would have known how to render a woman unconscious quickly using pressure points on the neck. Such a person could walk the streets of Whitechapel with bloodied hands or clothing without arousing suspicion, as they might have just assisted with childbirth or another medical procedure. As for the motive, Stewart theorizes that a midwife might have had a personal vendetta against women, possibly driven by a deep-seated grudge or desire for revenge. Further evidence supporting the theory that Jill the Ripper could be a midwife includes several key observations. 1. Anatomical knowledge. Basic anatomical knowledge would be required to carry out the mutilations seen in the Ripper cases. The removal of the victim's uteruses indicates a level of understanding of human anatomy consistent with someone in the medical or midwifery profession. 2. Absence of sexual assault. None of the Ripper's victims were sexually assaulted, which might suggest the perpetrator was more focused on the anatomical aspects of the crimes rather than sexual gratification. 3. Long fingernail scratches. The scratches on the victims' bodies appear to have been made by someone with long nails, which could suggest a female perpetrator. 4. Boot findings. 3 women's boot buttons were found near a victim who was wearing lace-up boots, not buttoned boots. This detail might indicate the presence of another woman who was involved in the crime, or perhaps the killer herself. Number 5. Neatly folded clothing. The neatly folded clothing at the feet of Annie Chapman, one of the victims, is a detail often associated with women, suggesting that the act of tidying or organizing the clothing could have been done by someone familiar with such practices. These points collectively strengthen the hypothesis that the Ripper could have been a woman, possibly a midwife or someone with similar expertise. Amelia Dyer is indeed a strong candidate for being Jill the Ripper. She lived in the Whitechapel area at various points in her life and was trained as a nurse and midwife, giving her the skills and knowledge necessary to perform the mutilations seen in the Ripper cases. Her background includes periods of institutionalization in mental hospitals, and she was known to have psychological instability. Dyer had a deep-seated resentment towards her past, particularly her troubled relationship with her mentally ill mother. Although she managed to suppress her hatred while her mother was alive, it is conceivable that these feelings could have resurfaced and driven her to seek revenge against other women. Moreover, Amelia's psychopathic personality adds weight to this theory. She was known for her lack of conscience, compassion, and remorse, driven solely by monetary gain. Such a disposition would make her capable of committing the same brutal acts as those attributed to the Ripper. While this theory remains speculative, the connections between Dyer's background and the Ripper's crimes certainly provide a compelling argument for her potential involvement. Indeed, this theory about Amelia Dyer remains speculative. Despite William Stewart's extensive examination of the evidence suggesting Dyer as a possible Jill the Ripper, he ultimately favored Mary Piercy as the primary suspect for the identity of the female killer. Mary Piercy was another criminal who fit the profile of a potential female serial killer, and Stewart's preference for her over Dyer underscores the complexity and difficulty of definitively identifying the Ripper. The theories and evidence surrounding the case continue to be debated and analyzed by researchers and historians.